chicken fight like a robot? A pillar of the arcade golden age arrives on the VCS in this Atari archive. Despite the home console industry's bread and butter being arcade conversions in the early 1980s, Atari itself had only a handful of new ones to speak of in 1982. We've already seen the company's takes on monster hits Pac-Man and Defender earlier this year, and now we come to their third and final arcade port for 1982, Stern Electronics' Berzerk. Stern Electronics was originally founded in 1976 as a pinball company after buying up the assets of the dying coin-op company Chicago Coin, scooping up the company Universal Research Labs and their video game division Electra Games not long afterwards to get a jump start into the solid-state side of things. Stern got into the video game business in 1980 by licensing Konami's Astro Invader, all while the former URL began development of its first in-house game. Leading development on this was Alan McNeil, a former Dave Nutting Associates developer who had worked on the Bally Professional Arcade and a handful of arcade games, but left after being blocked from designing his own. McNeil told historian Keith Smith for his unpublished book, All in Color for a Quarter, that he joined the URL folks to help finish their pinball machine Meteor as long as he got to design a video game. That game was Berzerk. According to Smith, McNeil's concept for Berzerk stemmed from a dream he had about a stick figure in a black and white video game surrounded by robots. He soon designed this into a prototype dubbed Robots, based on a basic game called Chase, which he'd likely seen in one of the several computer magazines that published it. Chase dates back to the Dartmouth time-sharing system, where it was written by an unknown author, but spread after computer engineer Bill Cotter saw it in action and ported it to the Honeywell 6000 mainframe, subsequently submitting it to Creative Computing. It essentially challenged players to evade a group of foes homing in on you one turn at a time, using the terrain to cause them to crash into obstacles and destroy themselves. It was seemingly the basis for the Channel F game Robot War, and seeing Chase in action makes it clear its relation to Berzerk. In his Robots prototype, the robots each feature a rotating eye reminiscent of the Cylons from Battlestar Galactica. Not that the robots were quite as fearsome as their inspirations, as McNeil deliberately humanized them by making them rather clumsy and inept, oftentimes destroying themselves by walking into walls or shooting each other. This, McNeil explained in the 1982 Winner's Book of Video Games, was because computers had a reputation for being cold and impersonal, and he wanted to try and change that perception. This initial version was quite difficult, however, and McNeil toned it down for a second version, Robot Picnic, that gave players their own laser gun and added in their randomly generated maze walls. Only now players could conceivably just stick around a room indefinitely, prompting McNeil to add an evil Otto, a bouncing smiley face that is indestructible, unstoppable, and will move in on the player directly. McNeil told Smith that Otto was named for a security manager at Dave Nutting Associates named Dave Otto, who annoyed the developers, and was designed after the Have a Nice Day smiley face, as he associated it with salespeople and corporations, who cover themselves with fake friendliness, as he put it. Finally, McNeil added a difficulty curve, with robots getting faster and more aggressive as you destroy more of their brethren and escape rooms. In the final version, this is exemplified by the robots changing color as you hit certain score thresholds. The game's famous voice synthesis was inspired by Williams' Gorgar pinball machine, using and combining voice samples recorded by a man who could enunciate clearly and in a monotone for the relatively low bitrate the game used. This gave the robots even more of a personality, and undoubtedly helped lead to its success. Berzerk, now named for the Berzerker series of books wherein killer robots seek to wipe out all life in the universe, was still a black and white game at this point, as Stern management saw no market for color games. This changed after Williams' Defender debuted, so Berzerk spent its final month of development being colorized through the use of an overlay board called Buffer System Color, capable of adding a single color overtop each sprite and object. All of these tribulations were worth it, as Berzerk was considered one of the standouts of the 1980 Amusement and Music Operators Association Expo and sold at least 15,000 units, winding up as Stern Electronics' most popular video game. It also has the dubious honor of being associated with an untimely death, as a teenager named Peter Bukowski died of a heart attack after playing the game at Friar Tuck's Game Room in South Holland, Illinois, in April 1982. An autopsy revealed that he had an undiagnosed heart condition, but nevertheless, media hyped up this link to Berzerk. As an arcade game, Berzerk is as unforgiving as you'd expect, but it is rather charming. The first few screens are inherently pretty easy to survive with yellow robots that don't really fight back. But once they gain the ability to fire at you, you need to become much more aware of their targeting blind spots, and just how long you have on a given stage before Evil Otto emerges. Otto will always appear at the side of the maze you entered, so getting away from that area safely must be a priority. Once you've wiped out all the robots on a screen, you'll get bonus points based on how many there were to begin with. But also, Evil Otto will speed up his pursuit, making it much easier to get crushed before you can get away with your points. Depending on the operator's settings, Berzerk can give you an extra life when you reach 5,000 or 10,000 points, both, or simply never. You'll probably want both of those if you're aiming to get far. The difficulty maxes out at 20,000 points, and it's hard to survive to that point in the first place. McNeil gave some advice in the Winner's Book of Video Games by Craig Kubey, recommending players hold down the fire button to align their targeting without moving their humanoid, and moving around in such a way that the robots will crash into walls and each other before they can ever threaten you. Finally, McNeil noted the bulletproof necktie. The gap between the humanoid's head and body is just big enough to fit a laser shot through without counting as a hit, which can be worth taking advantage of if you can't get out of the way of the shot entirely. We know very little about Berzerk's development for the VCS, as Dan Hitchens doesn't appear to have done any interviews that I've been able to find and didn't respond to my own efforts to reach him. Nor are there really any in-development prototypes floating around to glean insights from. We do know Atari announced the game at the January Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas for a summer release, but very little else about its licensing or porting. Nevertheless, it's a remarkably feature-complete rendition of the arcade game. Despite being a lower resolution than its originator, almost all of the elements of Berzerk are here. The robots have similar difficulty scaling, the mazes are still, for all intents and purposes, randomly generated, and you still have Evil Otto, depending on the game settings. Already this puts it in the realm of being a more accurate translation than Pac-Man or Defender were for Atari, with the loss of voice synthesis and the inability of the robots to shoot diagonally, as the only real changes. Even the bulletproof necktie made it over. In fairness to those other two conversions, Berzerk as a game is not quite as complex a design, and it's clearly well suited to the VCS hardware. The difficulty switches do nothing here, but there is nonetheless quite the array of game variations to keep one busy. The variations will adjust whether or not Evil Otto is in play, if you can rebound Otto back to his starting point by shooting him, whether or not the robots fire lasers, and if you gain extra lives every 1,000 points, 2,000 points, or never. Game 12 is the children's mode with no Otto, non-firing robots, and plentiful extra lives. Game 9 on the flip side provides you no extra lives, armed robots, and an invincible Otto, making it the trickiest to contend with. While it's more generous than the arcade game with lives in most modes, this is a fair trade-off given the mazes themselves being more cramped. These can all make for some interesting gameplay twists. Writer Jen Frank once remarked on the defunct oneup.com that one of her favorite ways to chill out was to just run the game on a mode with no Evil Otto or armed robots. Rather than shoot them herself, she'd instead try and lure the machines all into walls or each other. The bizarre storyline laid out in the manual, alongside some really excellent art, portrays you as a member of a space crew visiting the planet Mazon, where you've been marooned after the Automazons destroyed your ship and chased you into their maze, where they and their master Evil Otto now hunt you. Adding to the comic book flair of the title, it was also packed in with the second issue of the Atari Force comic, following on from Defender's inclusion of the first issue. Even though this game isn't nearly as difficult as its arcade counterpart, it still does an excellent job of providing a challenge. The mazes aren't as complex, and the objects are all comparatively bigger, but it's recognizably Berzerk and plays remarkably well. Without Evil Otto, Berzerk does come off as a more cat-and-mouse experience where you can take your time to deal with the robots. But the options where he shows up really shine. Even having the ability to temporarily keep Otto away doesn't make the game necessarily easier, as lining up shots on that bouncing jerk is a skill in its own right. I'll also commend the children's mode as really being suitable for small kids, as the lack of Otto and relatively docile robots gives plenty of opportunity to get a handle on the game's controls. Hitchens nailed what made the arcade game so enjoyable and did so within a dinky VCS cartridge. Atari has had some enjoyable releases thus far in 1982, particularly Haunted House, Yar's Revenge, and Defender, and this is right up there with the best of them. Owing to its fidelity and the general appeal of the source material, Berzerk for the VCS reviewed quite well. Electronic Games was understandably wary after Atari's Pac-Man, but came away duly impressed with Hitchin's effort. They note that despite the number of characters on screen, there is no flicker to be found, suggesting that the fact that only a handful of robots are moving at any given time is a factor. The video game update gave it 3.5 stars each for play and graphics, highlighting the sound design, arcade faithfulness, and graphical flourishes like the electrocution animation. Writing for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Lou Hudson remarked this was a good, tough game, and while he believed Defender was Atari's best effort, his teenage technical advisors favored Berzerk. Playboy's Games periodical also highlighted its arcade faithfulness, while Logical Gamer focused more on the game itself, with reviewers appreciating its pacing, speed, and difficulty, while questioning why Evil Otto is a smiley face. While it didn't win any awards in the 1983 Arkies, Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz did give it a Certificate of Merit for Best Solitary Game, losing out to Donkey Kong on the Colecovision. Berzerk was a pretty popular one for Atari, as befitting its status as an arcade hit. The Atari internal sales memo seen in Once Upon Atari indicates it sold nearly 1.8 million copies in 1982, albeit with enough returns in 1983 to see a net negative of 20,314 units that year and an unknown number in 1984. In the latter years of the VCS, internal records show that Atari shipped 71,869 copies between 1986 and 1989, an extremely respectable amount for a game from the early 1980s. All told, this puts its known sales somewhere in the ballpark of 1,850,328 copies, give or take another 26,000 or so. These were strong enough sales for Atari to track it as their 6th best-selling game since 1980. Billboard also tracked it as a consistent sight in the top seller charts in the fall of 1982, the only one of Atari's games to make the top 5, dominated otherwise by Pitfall, Frogger, Megamania, and Donkey Kong. At the end of the year, Manny Gerard, CEO of Warner, remarked in comments that Atari had lost ground to the recent wave of third parties, particularly to Donkey Kong and Frogger, and that Atari only having a single arcade port for the second half of the year, Berzerk, was likely a factor. In that regard, Berzerk seemed to have been a catalyst for Atari to go in much harder on arcade ports in 1983, which we'll see eventually. Atari had the Berzerk console rights, but that didn't stop the game from making the rounds. Atari produced a magnificent enhanced version for the 5200 console, debuting early in 1984. This conversion features higher resolution graphics, voice synthesis, and the diagonal robot fire functionality missing from the VCS port. This was also intended to come out for the Atari 8-bit computers, but never did for reasons unknown. In its place, and presumably due to how long it took for the 5200 to get an official port, developer Kubey created Crazy Shootout, debuting in 1981 on the 8-bit computers and ported to the 5200 in 1983. While it lacked the voice synthesis, it nevertheless plays similarly other than replacing Evil Otto with a simple timer to escape each room and the robots leaving behind deadly debris fields. That said, Berzerk did appear officially licensed on the GCE Vectrex console as part of its debut lineup. Most likely the Vectrex's standalone nature allowed them to license the game outside of Atari's rights. This port was also remarkably faithful given the dramatically different visual style of the hardware, and similarly reviewed quite well. Stern itself published a sequel to Berzerk called Frenzy in 1982. McNeil had quit Stern due to a lack of cash bonuses or a raise, only to be lured back by the promise of royalties. And his first project was a sequel that utilized all his unused ideas for Berzerk. This includes unique types of robots, different types of walls, a destructible but respawning Evil Otto, and 4 special rooms that the player could stumble across that either represented unique threats or advantages. It was a reasonable success, reportedly selling 12,000 units, and while Atari failed to secure the console rights to this one, they instead went to Coleco, which produced a rather faithful port to the ColecoVision. Unsurprisingly, there were unlicensed knockoffs and games inspired by Berzerk as well. On the Intellivision, the 1982 release Night Stalker carried over the concepts of robots in a maze, but took it in a slower, more methodical direction. Here you have robots that are more aggressive and eventually more resilient, as well as limited ammo that you must periodically risk getting into harm's way to replenish. On the Arcadia 2001, meanwhile, owners had the opportunity to play Escape, also sold in other regions as Robot Killer with graphics that resemble Berzerk more closely. This retains the robot's evil auto in some fairly simplistic mazes, but falls down over how incredibly slow the game moves. And on the Bally Arcade, Wavemakers published Castle of Horror, a sort of mashup of Berzerk and Heiankyo Alien, where you elude monsters by laying down blocks to try and draw them on top of. Alternatively, you can escape out the door at the bottom of the screen when it's open. Author Mike Peace remarked that it was among his favorite games he wrote, and a pretty strong seller, as many of his other titles were. There's also a Muck for the Odyssey 2, the first homebrew game ever developed for that platform, and about as faithful a port of Berzerk as you could ask for on the machine, save for failing to use the voice to bring in the voice synthesis from the arcade game. Even the recent indie game Die for the Economy pulls heavily from Berzerk and Frenzy for its aesthetic and playstyle. But all respect is due to Berzerk. The original game has a powerful draw to it that the VCS replicates perfectly, and if Atari could only have one top seller for these ensuing months, this game clearly earned every one of them. As a licensed game, Berzerk wasn't reissued for a long time, but it wasn't forgotten. In 2002, Atari VCS music enthusiast Paul Slocum created a hack of Berzerk that replaced the audio with a pretty solid rendition of the band Styx's song Mr. Roboto. That same year, developer Mike Mika wrote a hack dubbed Berzerk Voice Enhanced that added back in some of the voice synthesis samples to the VCS version, blanking the screen while they play. And once Atari acquired the Stern Electronics video game library in 2023, both of the 1980s retail releases, along with this voice-enhanced homebrew, finally returned as DLC for the Atari 50 collection. A new Berzerk game, Berzerk Recharged, came out in 2024, reimagining it as a twin-stick shooter, akin to the unrelated but thematically similar Robotron 2084. This is one of the platform's best arcade conversions, and it's good to see it available once more. Next time, Froggy went to courtin'.